Today I'm here with Vaibhav Diwadkar to talk about cold exposure, or so I thought. That turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg, beneath which lie the dynamic, mysterious inner workings of the human brain, most of which remain hidden in the dark. This is a conversation about what we don't know, about what neuroscience can't explain, about the power and the limits of the human brain. It's a conversation I never wanted to end, an empty grasp towards knowledge, shooting stars in the sky, with Vaibhav Diwadkar. So today I'd like to learn about the human brain. I mean, I guess that's what this podcast is about, but you've gotten into some extra research and you have some more information about maybe how the brain actually works, and maybe we're wrong about what the human brain is. So before we get into that research, let's kind of get into what is the conventional understanding of the human brain currently?
It's almost impossible for me to answer that question because there are many conventional understandings. And, before I answer that question, let me quote one of my favorite quotes, which I think really, in many ways, encapsulates the problem that we face in trying to understand the human brain. And I've heard this quote attributed to Emerson Puge, who was a computer scientist. I think he worked at IBM. And the quote goes something like this. He is supposed to have said that if the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we could not. So let that quote seep in for a little bit, because it's kind of a self-referential, nested quote. And basic point that Puge is making, the basic insight he's making, and this is not only his insight, many others have come up with this insight, is the human brain is kind of unique as an object in the universe where it is consigned to having to study itself. We cannot think of any other object in the universe, to our knowledge, which is fated to have to do that. And so we have this sort of mass of tissue with some volume, with these folds that is encased within our cranium. And from it comes everything that makes us what we are. And for years and years, it was almost impossible to get signals from within this tissue, or what people call in vivo. And it's only over the last 100 years or so that scientists have been able to penetrate into the tissue and start to get signals from it. So it started with research in animals. Regardless of what your position is on animal research, that's where it started, where you could actually get extracellular recordings from behaving animals by surgically implanting electrodes on the surface of neurons. And this led to all kinds of theories about how extracellular discharges in the brain are associated with behavior, and they are at the seat of behavior. But we, of course, knew that not to be true after a very short period of time. But of course, a lot of these studies were only done in animals. And it was only about 30 years ago that, through sort of a quirk of the oddness of how the brain deals with blood flow and how changes in blood flow and the oxygenation and deoxygenation of tissue under neuronal activity give rise to different physical properties, that we were able to use magnetic resonance imaging to look at human brain function in a certain way, something that is called functional MRI. And so these techniques are extremely new. And if you really think about it, think about the arc of our understanding in physics, how long it took us from when physics began as a discipline, when it was called natural philosophy. It took us it took us centuries to arrive at Newtonian mechanics, and centuries after that to arrive both at general relativity and quantum theory. So if you think about it, we have actually been studying the human brain, for maybe a few decades. And this is, as we said at the very outset, is quite easily the most complicated biological object that we know of, and is likely to exist in the universe. There may be other systems that have analogs of it, but no matter what system we're talking about, the brain is most likely the the most complex biological object in the universe. So it's completely unlikely that we have a straightforward answer to how the brain works. We just really don't know. And so neuroscience as a branch of science is highly tentative. Science is tentative, as we know. Neuroscience is even more tentative because of the complexity of the system that you're trying to decipher. See, the problem with trying to understand the human brain is, what is it that you're trying to understand? Are you trying to understand its structural architecture, sort of how the cortex folds in on itself, why it does? What are the tracks within the cortex that communicate with each other? Are we trying to understand how different functional signals at different resolutions, at the millisecond scale, the nanosecond scale, the second scale, the minute scale, how they are all related to each other? Are we trying to understand how neurons are related to ensembles of neurons and how they are related to maps? Are we trying to understand how all of this neurophysiological activity gives rise to behavior? Are we trying to understand how the behavior that we engage in re-enters the brain through re-entrant loops and then modifies brain activity on a dynamic basis? Tell me where to stop, because this is just a sliver of the challenge that you deal with when you're trying to work with the brain or try to understand the brain. And I don't think I need to convince you anymore that we are really at a pre-Galilean stage, if you think about it. We're in a pre-Galilean age of neuroscience. That's where we are.
Yeah. And as you're talking about that, I couldn't pin it down, and that was sort of the feeling of like this brain is moving with the world and with our body and with our behavior, and it's like this moving target. So how could we even really pin it down and say this is what it is, especially in only 20 or 30 years? But we'll talk about that later. But how about the animal brain? You said we've been studying the animal brain longer. So I guess my question is, of course, there's many different types of animals. There's reptiles, there's mammals, there's higher level mammals with larger brains, like apes, including us. But do we have a better understanding of at least some type of animal brain?
So actually, there's reasonably good understanding of multicellular animal systems. Like, I think Drosophila, there's a reasonable understanding of Drosophila. There's a reasonable understanding of C. elegans. In fact, the C. elegans connectome, I think, was recently mapped out completely. So that's the earthworm. Anytime you get beyond that, now your understanding starts to degrade astoundingly, at an astounding rate. And the reason, I don't think the reasons are known, but this is my speculation. Biological systems evolved. We know that we evolved. And they evolved through some complex set of interactions between genetic mutation, between the environment, between social interactions, how social interactions became baked into the genetic architecture of the species, how that genetic architecture then became passed down through evolution, how the genetic architectures began to shape or continually shape behavior, how that behavior then somehow re-entered patterns of genetic expression and genetic transmission. And so when we talk about neuronal systems, superficially there are tons of similarities across neuronal systems. So neurons are neurons. And so a neuron in C. elegans presumably has the same basic architecture as a neuron in a macaque or a neuron in a human brain. But the problem is that neurons by themselves can't really do much. They do very basic things, which is why a system like the earthworm, which has a very accountably finite set of neurons, engages in very simple behaviors. None of us would really want to come back as an earthworm. It's not a very interesting existence to have. And so what probably has happened is, over evolution, it's not just that brains became bigger, but somehow evolution shaped species in different ways. So some species evolved such that post-gestation, they're at a state that is very close to an approximation of their ultimate state of development. And so the postnatal influences on these neuronal systems tends to be very limited. But there are other species, and human beings are singular in that sense, who come into the world very far away from where they end up about 15 to 20 years postnatally. So they have a very protracted developmental profile, which is heavily shaped not just by the genetic endowment that they come with, but also the profound set of interactions that they have with the environment. Those interactions can be perceptual, they're sensory motor, they're social, they're emotional, almost impossible to quantify. And so these are the influences that shape the human brain. And a lot of research in animals, which has tried to consider animals as analogues of humans, is simply not able to simulate the conditions under which the human brain develops postnatally. In fact, when we study human populations using experimental psychology or whatever, we are completely unable to quantify the 20 years of life experiences that got the participant to where they are in the laboratory. You see? So I think you appreciate the challenge that we are dealing with. So there are many controversies about the value of animal research in and how it relates to our understanding of the human brain. So the study of animals for the sake of understanding animals is a separate question. And so there have been enormously interesting studies about primate cultures, for example, observational studies. There have been enormously interesting experimental studies about the navigational system in rats. So, for example, the enormously intricate role that hippocampal place cells play in allowing the rodents to navigate in an extremely hostile world with relatively few visual cues. Okay. But the relevance of that kind of work for our understanding of the humans, I have to think that it's extremely, extremely tentative. And I would say it's highly, highly speculative. And in fact, we are now beginning to understand more and more, as we understand the human brain more and more, we're understanding the limitations of the relevance of those animal studies for our understanding of human brain function.
Okay, so what is this animal brain like? I mean, you could take any example that kind of fits, and then how is that brain maybe teaching us something about our brain, but not really?
So, to my knowledge, the most interesting studies have been done in comparative neurology between the brains of monkeys and the brains of humans. And there appears to be an enormous amount of similarity in certain kinds of regions. So, for example, the visual cortex. And it's very interesting. The similarities are the highest in regions that are thought to subserve the kinds of functions that are shared between the species. So, for example, monkeys have eyes that are placed in front of their face, and so they engage in binocular fusion. And so when they look at a complex scene, just like we do, their eyes are thought to function similarly to the way that our eyes function. And so, not surprisingly, areas of their brain, like the occipital cortex, are very similar to our occipital cortex. Their parietal lobes is thought to be very closely a homologue of our parietal lobe. So these are higher order visual regions per se. But where things start to break down and become very poorly understood is when you look at the repertoire of behaviors that humans start to engage in that monkeys simply do not seem to engage in. So, language is a very good example. Monkeys communicate, but they do not seem to have, and this is a controversial question, but they do not seem to use, or there's no evidence that suggests that they use language to the extent that we use language. And this is actually a very deep question. Why is it that humans use language to the full degree of its symbolic capabilities? Why are humans able to use a extremely complex set of syntactic structures to communicate? So there is no evidence that monkeys can do that. And so you hear these studies which talk about the genetic overlap between monkeys and humans, and you hear numbers bandied about like 97% genetic overlap and so on. But the fact that our behavioral repertoires are so substantially different than monkeys is telling us something. It's telling us that the behavior that we engage in appears to be quite different than the behaviors that our closest ancestors seem to engage in. And there isn't a straightforward reason why, because again, when you look at the brains of humans and monkeys, there are lots of superficial similarities. But it may well be that the small degrees of dissimilarities that humans possess, so for example, and there's evidence that suggests this, the enlarged nature of our frontal lobes. Why do we have these enlarged frontal lobes? So these are thought to be evolutionarily newer areas of the brain. The fact that our brain size may not be particularly unusual relative to our body, but the fact that we have, as I was saying a few minutes ago, such a protracted postnatal developmental profile, that suggests that the interactions that humans have with the environment during the very formative stages of neurodevelopment play an enormous role in shaping our behavioral repertoire in a way that our closest ancestors or our closest relatives' interactions with the environment, they don't play that role. Language is a perfectly salient example. If you can take a child born into any linguistic environment and have them grow up through a certain critical period of development in almost any other linguistic environment. And they learn the language without it being taught to them. They learn language under extreme conditions of the poverty of stimulus. Nobody teaches them language. Nobody teaches them the rules of grammar, but they learn it all on their own. And so what that is suggesting is that there are certain critical periods of development that are associated with domains that are intrinsically human, intrinsically Homo sapien. It cuts across ethnic groups, it cuts across human cultures. And this is telling us that even though there is a degree of continuity in the evolutionary tree, there are these discontinuities when you think of behavioral repertoires and behavioral complexities. And I don't think we have a clear understanding of that.
Okay, so we clearly have these enlarged frontal lobes, and with that comes language. What else is going on in these frontal lobes that isn't happening in, even chimpanzees or gorillas and these guys who are kind of close to us?
So I would say that the fact that we have enlarged frontal lobes isn't enough to give us language. I would say that it gives us a set of regions and subregions in the brain that expand the repertoire of connectomic configurations that the brain can engage in. So essentially, and this is a very simple model, and I'm not advancing this as being a true model, but imagine that you're building a system which is a highly connected system. Now, within this highly connected system, you have discrete components. And so you keep adding discrete components to the system. Now, the number of connections that you can form within the system grows exponentially as a function of the number of discrete components that the system has. Now, we can pretend that this is kind of true of the human brain, and it's probably not untrue, though it's not the complete story. But the interesting thing about the human brain is that it has a vastly higher number of these components. Let's just pretend that they're neurons, even though that's again an oversimplification. And you have this enormously complex postnatal period of neurodevelopment that is linked to how the individual interacts with the environment. And so this postnatal period is being constantly shaped in ways that we don't know, and it's impossible for us to really capture while the individual is interacting with this environment. And all of these interactions on a dynamic basis are continually shaping the system, which is why if you want a child to learn language, You have to make sure that they're in a linguistic environment from very early on. And we know this from studies of children who were, I think, abducted by or lost in jungles and so on, who actually don't acquire language and in fact cannot speak, and they can acquire language later, but not in the same way as humans naturally acquire language. And so it's not so much a question just of the frontal lobe, I think. The point is that the addition of these evolutionarily newer regions increases the repertoire of the kinds of configurations that get formed on a dynamic basis in the human brain. And most likely, these configurations are the closest neural correlate of behavior. So when I'm speaking to you or when you're listening to me, it's not because we have one region of the brain that is doing something. It's not just one region of the brain that is producing language in me, and it's just not one region of the brain that is allowing you to comprehend what I say. It is a repertoire, if you will. It's an engram of connections that is giving rise to this behavior on a dynamic basis. I have no idea what I'm going to be saying in the next 10 seconds. You have no idea about what specifically I'm going to be saying in the next 10 seconds. But I can utter a sentence in the next 10 seconds that I probably have never uttered before in my life. And you have never heard that sentence as uttered before in your life. Yet we do it with facility. Why do we do it with facility? It's impossible for us to do it if you had a one-to-one mapping between language and a specific region of the brain. The only way you can do this is if the brain is dynamically forming these repertoires as it's interacting with the environment. And somehow, in ways that we don't clearly understand, these dynamically formed repertoires are allowing us to engage in the kind of overt behavior that we are engaging in.
It reminds me of I studied philosophy. It reminds me of like Martin Heidegger or something. He's saying we are a being in the world, and the human and the world are like one system. You can't separate the human from the world, from the social world. It's all kind of one, I guess, larger brain in a way. And then also, it kind of makes me think too, like the brain itself is sort of that way. Like we can't think of, oh, the prefrontal cortex is me, or this is the animal part of my brain, or this is the reptile part of my brain. It's all one brain, just like how we are one being connected to this world. So it makes things way more complicated, because how can you study something when it's part of this interacting network of things? Yeah, very confusing, but also very exciting, because it's like we're getting into the neuroscience of philosophy now.
And, I think you raise a really, really compelling question. And it's a question that researchers in the West are now returning to after, for many decades, treating the brain as sort of this device in isolation, which could be thought of in purely algorithmic terms or thought of in purely functional terms. But people are now returning to, you talked about Heidegger, people are returning to trying to think about the phenomenological basis of human experience. So for the longest time, sort of the basic idea of neuroscience was a certain branch of neuroscience or neurophilosophy was everything that we do, it's all biological. After all, we've had mechanics that has explained the physical world to us. It has explained the chemical world to us. So all of our phenomenological experiences, in principle, can only be reduced to their biological physical correlates. Okay. Now, it's one thing to have that as a philosophical position and argue about that, but it's quite another thing to actually develop a experimental program around that. And as people are discovering more and more and more, phenomenological experience, whatever it might be, whatever its specific neurobiological correlates might be, is very intrinsic to how the brain creates reality for us. And what hard philosophers of neuroscience are doing for us is they're making it clear, what does neuroscience need to explain? Neuroscience cannot explain away things by saying that, oh, Okay, it's really difficult for us to explain this now, but eventually we'll get to it. No, neuroscience has to try and place the phenomenological experience of pain in a certain framework, the phenomenological experience of awareness in a certain framework, the phenomenological experience of happiness and sadness and grief. These are all real experiences. And it doesn't pay to say that these are just creations of the brain. We want to know how they're creations of the brain. And so the point that you raise, I think, is really timely because people in Western science are more and more accepting that phenomenological reality is a reality and that we have to understand the relationship between the emergence of phenomenological experiences and their reduction into the underlying neural substrate. So, in other words, you cannot simply say that all phenomenological states, all conscious states, can just simply be reduced to neuronal states. That may well be that they have neuronal correlates, but it is seeming increasingly likely that these states that are emergent from the underlying neural substrate at some scale are having causal effects on that same substrate. And this is an extremely interesting and it's a very vexing area of work that it's going to be very difficult to grapple with.
Yeah, and these things like, well, emotions, anger, sadness, jealousy, these phenomenological experiences, along with things like pain and stress and things. Even then, yeah, I guess you could try to pin it down in the brain and say, this is where stress exists. This is what causes the pain and stuff. But if it's true that the brain is a dynamic system, like you were saying, humans have this weird experience of experience. I don't know if animals feel things like sadness and anger and, clearly they feel pain, but the way that humans experience these, and I guess what I'm trying to get at is trying to pin down what's even going on in the brain during any kind of experience. It can't just be this mechanistic thing, but it's this dynamic thing going on. So how do you explain this kind of stuff?
So I would argue actually that there is nowhere in the brain where something can be found. Just as we talked about the example of language a few minutes ago. So the fact that I'm speaking to you, it isn't one area of the brain that is allowing me to speak to you. It is true that there is one area of the brain that is more associated with speech production than other areas of the brain. And so people who talk about brain function use terms like relative specialization of function and how information is integrated across regions. And so the idea is that there are certain regions that have a high degree of relative specialization of function. If you remember a few minutes ago, we talked about the visual cortex, the occipital lobe. That has a high degree of relative specialization of function for vision. The olfactory bulb has a high degree of relative specialization of function for olfaction. The same with primary auditory cortex. But that's a very uninteresting way of thinking about brain function. It's kind of like thinking of the wheel of your automobile, if you own one, but the wheel of an automobile has a high degree of relative specialization for rolling or reducing friction as the automobile runs. But that doesn't tell you the complete story of how this dynamic system is running, you see? And so this idea of finding where in the brain something is, it really kind of goes back a couple of 100 years ago to this notion of phrenology, which you probably heard of the term phrenology. And I think Francis Gall is the one most associated with that. And of course, that was based on a simple model at the time, because after all, they had no techniques available to them other than kind of thinking through things. And at the time, the few types of data that had emerged were lesion data. And so the lesion data, as patient comes in, they suddenly stop being able to speak. And then the treating physician realizes that either they had a head injury to a certain part of the brain, or they may have presumed to have had a stroke, though they had no way of knowing at the time. And so from the technology that was available to them, which was largely observational, they built these phrenological theories of the brain. And so that's where the idea emerged that you have certain regions of the brain that are associated with certain behaviors. Because after all, if the technology at that time is telling you that if there's something that happens to this brain region and you lose a behavior, well, logically it suggests that this behavior is strongly dependent, or in fact entirely dependent, on this brain region. But of course, we know this now not to be true, because as technology allowed us to gather more and more information from the brain, we now know that this model is true in uninteresting ways. And that's where the relative specialization of function comes in. And the other interesting thing to think about from this discussion is that theory in neuroscience, and we don't always realize it, is very much yoked to the technology that allows you to collect data from the brain. And so this example of phrenology, the technology that was available to scientists at the time, if you call it a technology, was just observational, like I said. What's happening to patients? Well, that's a kind of technology. And so they used it as best as they could to come up with theories of how the brain created behavior. Fast forward 100 years later, and now people are able to record from the surface of neurons in animals and then begin to try and correlate those recordings with basic behaviors in monkeys, like the movement of eyes, or in rodents, navigation, and so on. And the theory that emerges is of the role of individual neurons in modulating behavior. Okay. But now you fast forward 100 years on from that, and now we are able to study more complicated behavior repertoires that you see in humans. And we know now that that kind of a model is simply insufficient to explain the complex sets of behaviors that we can engage in. And so this is what I said at the very outset, that science is tentative and neuroscience is even more tentative than science. And so the challenge of understanding brain dynamics, how it gives rise to function on a continuing basis, this is an extremely, extremely non-trivial challenge.
Right. So we're never really going to get any answers today. We're just going to kind of clarify some of these questions, if anything, and be like, oh, this is what we don't know, but maybe this is true. And that's a bit unsettling because usually you're like, you expect to get some answers, but I guess we're going to get more questions than answers today. You did mention dynamic systems, and that might be a new word for a lot of people. So perhaps you could define what is a dynamic system and give some examples of what are some other non-brain dynamic systems in the universe.
Well, so everyone knows what a system is. Dynamic systems are simply systems that are continually changing, and they change and respond to how they take inputs and how their outputs are optimized to respond to the inputs that they're taking. And so the human brain, or in fact any brain, is a dynamical system because it's constantly changing. It's constantly moving. It's not static. The idea of this dynamical systems theory is actually, it's a extremely specialized branch of physics and mathematics, where people are specifically interested in studying the dynamics of complex systems. And so this comes from also the complex systems world. And you can actually characterize dynamic systems at complicated levels. You probably have heard of chaos theory. Chaos, yeah.
Yeah.
And so chaos theory actually was a branch that was designed to understand the properties of dynamical systems, taking systems as a whole. And so almost any neuronal system is a dynamical system because it is constantly changing to inputs, and its outputs are trying to maximize or optimize its interactions with the world. And so when you see migratory birds, for example, going from north to south, well, why do they migrate from north to south? Because they want to optimize their chance of survival. Why do they fly in the formations that they fly? Because they're trying to optimize the efficiency and the speed with which they actually get from where they need to leave from to where they have to go towards. And so almost any biological system that you can think about is a dynamical system because they all have their different properties. Different systems have different degrees of complexity. We talked about the human brain as perhaps being the most complex of all dynamical systems. But almost any such system can be thought of as a dynamical system. You can have physical systems that are dynamical systems. So, for example, when you're heating a pot of water on your stove, that's a dynamical system because the molecular interactions change as a function of heat transferring into the water. And so now the properties of the system are changing. Of course, it's a different kind of a dynamical system than thinking about the brain, but dynamical systems are everywhere around us.
Okay. And then I guess some technology is not dynamic and some technology is dynamic. Yeah. What are some aside from animals and humans and stuff and living things, what are some like non-dynamic machines or technologies versus dynamic ones?
Well, even though a car, when it's moving, is dynamic, you might argue that any system that is forward engineered, all mechanical systems, cars, airplanes, any kind of engineering device that is forward engineered, its states are completely predictable from the engineering that went into it. And so you might argue that at their very basis, these are not dynamical systems because they are, even though they engage in dynamics on a continuing basis, they don't have the same flavor as biological systems have, which were engineered by evolution. And we have to reverse engineer ourselves to an understanding of their mechanics. We don't have to reverse engineer ourselves to our understanding of the automobile. We know how it works because it was engineered that way, or a microwave, or whatever example you want to think of. So I think you can roughly think of that as sort of the salient difference between biological systems and mechanical systems.
Are any animals? I guess you mentioned the earthworm is kind of on the edge between dynamic and predictable.
Yeah, so I don't know. Obviously, I'm not as knowledgeable about C. elegans, but it is still what people would call an open system. So in biology, people have made the distinction between, or in complex systems work, actually, people have made the distinction between open systems and closed systems. So people talk about the prototypical example is the universe is a closed system. What does that mean? Well, when you think of the universe, it's not actually interacting with anything. It doesn't take inputs and outputs. You can kind of explain its laws up to a certain degree with equations, with mathematics, and so on. Open systems are different. So open systems are systems that are embodied, in our case, within our body, and that they allow us to interact with the environment. And so we have a certain set of principles that we don't know are enshrined within our biology, and those become conditions that allow us to interact in dynamical ways with our environment and to optimize our interactions with our environment. And so that's probably a very straightforward way to think of biological systems and non-biological systems. And thought of in that way, C. elegans is very much a biological system and an open system because it's like any other species. C. elegans hopes to maximize its survivability within its environment. And the system will do anything that it can to maximize its survivability within the environment. And to do that, it needs to have very basic kinds of receptors that are responsive to the kinds of signals, the exteroceptive signals that it gets, the signals from outside. Now, humans actually have an enormous, actually, the more complicated the biological system becomes, it seems that in addition to exteroception, we also have interoception. That is, we are also able to take these exteroceptive signals and transform them into interoceptive states of how we feel. How do we feel when we stand outside when we are cold? And we can put off feeling unbearably cold for a certain period of time through behavioral thermal regulation. But eventually, those interoceptive states guide us in terms of how we behave. And so the distinction, how exteroception and interoception are linked, it almost certainly is related to the complexity of the biological architecture in the central nervous system. So the earthworm has an extremely simple central nervous system with I don't know how many hundreds of neurons, but very few hundred. Whereas I don't mean to sound anthropomorphic when I say this, but at the other end of the spectrum, you have the human brain, which has an extremely well developed interoceptive system that allows us actually to do all kinds of things.
Let's get into some concrete examples. You've been doing a lot of research on cold exposure. You mapped Wim Hof's brain, and he might be a good example into all of the stuff we're talking about today as a human with a very dynamic system. Yeah, so I guess we can start. We're going back to animals. How would a typical there's no typical animal, but yeah, how would certain animals experience the cold or react to the cold? And what can humans do with regards to cold exposure that the animals just can't?
Well, I mean, the most simple are sort of reptilian species who are cold blooded. And so they actually live in very hostile environments because they have a very narrow thermal band within which their body temperature exists. And so the fact that they're cold-blooded means that they don't really have to engage in a lot of thermal regulatory behavior. But of course, these systems are also, in terms of their behavioral repertoire, are simpler. Now, if you start to think about homeotherms, that is warm-blooded animals, so you talk about macaques, you talk about apes, humans, now you start to get into what I was talking about a little while ago, this sort of balance or the interplay between exteroception and interoception. And so when we feel cold, when one of us as an individual feels cold, we don't change our core body temperature. We actually engage in behaviors that allow us to evade the cold. And why are we able to engage in these behaviors that allow us to evade the cold? Well, because we have this, I keep using the word behavioral repertoire, but we have the complexity in our brain that creates behavioral repertoires that allow us to engage in adaptive behaviors over and above what, say, reptilian species might engage in. And so what this means is that as a species, we can inhabit almost anywhere on the planet. We can live in deserts. We can live in the Arctic. We can live in the tropics. We can live in the Arctic Circle. And why can we do that? It's not because we evolved to be impervious to cold stress or heat stress. This range that humans have evolved because humans were able to create conditions that overcame the kind of cold stress and heat stress that the environment gives to us. And so this repertoire, which people have termed behavioral thermal regulation, it allows us to engage in behaviors using which we can maintain our core body temperature within an optimal range. Using these behaviors, we can engage in thermal regulatory defense. We have other behaviors that are remarkable and people are now beginning to try and understand. And so, for example, we can engage in prospection. If I leave my home in the morning when the temperature is at a certain level, but I expect that the temperature might fall 8 hours from now, I can plan for that by packing an extra coat. Now, this seems very trivial because we do it all the time, right? But actually, it's not very trivial. Imagine if you had to design a system from scratch to do this. How does the system do it? Well, the system has to engage in what we might generally call, or what people have called, predictive processing. The system has to predict what might happen 8 hours from now or 12 hours from now into the future and engage in actions now that can offset negative repercussions to them in the future. Now, those repercussions may or may not happen, but you have a system that can actually move, not just think backwards in time, but paradoxically think forwards in time. And so this is something we do all the time in terms of behavioral thermal regulation. We never think much about it because, again, as I said, the human brain is taxed with the challenge of finding out how it works. And so its workings, which seem trivial to us as we are experiencing them, we only realize that they're non-trivial when we sit back and look back upon what those workings are, and we think about how might you have to build a system that can do everything that we do with the kind of facility that we do it with.
That's super fascinating. You think of us as, we're warm blooded, and what does it mean to be warm blooded? I don't know, maybe you shiver and your body somehow survives regardless of the temperature. But then I guess this is a special human thing. It's not all mammals, but we are able to engage in behaviors that keep us warm. And yeah, of course, all mammals can't do this, but we can project into the future and like predict how the weather and how the environment's going to be. And then as a result of that, we can prepare, like get some clothes or, maybe stay home or do different things, actual movements and, items and things. But also, like, just the imagination alone, it seems like might even kind of get us through it. I'm thinking of my brother, for example. My brother's been homeless for the past 3 years or something, but he's in California, not in Detroit where you are. He wouldn't be able to survive with his imagination alone out there. But I'm thinking, how does he survive every winter? It does still get close to freezing, and how do you survive? I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess he's doing it too, or he can predict, okay, March is next, and after March is April, and not only will that help him probably prepare like how to survive, with blankets, etc., or certain locations, but maybe also like this idea that spring is coming, summer is coming. Mentally, you kind of can fight through it. Whereas if you didn't know that, you might just imagine this is never going to end, and then if you thought this is never going to end, winter is never going to end, you might just somehow die more quickly. This is fascinating. It's not just the physical behaviors we're doing, but it's these mental, imaginary behaviors too, it seems.
And I think humans are probably unique. I don't know if this has been well studied or not, but humans are probably unique in that they can take past experiences, which memory researchers call episodic experiences, episodic memory. And from these past experiences, they can actually engage in future simulations. And these future simulations are about events that haven't happened, but they could happen because of what we've experienced in the past or what we know. And in creating these simulations, you can attach, and we probably do this reflexively, we can attach certain probabilities to them. And, again, like I said, we do it reflexively. It's not like you're sitting there and calculating the exact probability, but not that different from how weather forecasters might have a probability attached to rain or a probability that you might see hail or snow. Of course, those are very explicit quantitative models. But there is good evidence now that suggests that humans engage in some of this kind of work heuristically. That is, they have this heuristic ability to simulate futures. And the simulation of those futures, it has positive benefits, but it can also have very negative benefits. So, for example, one of the characteristics that has been associated with depression is this idea of rumination. So, this idea of rumination is constantly thinking about bad things, about negative things. But part of it also is constantly thinking that negative things or bad things will happen in the future. So, why does that happen? Why does the human brain in depression lead individuals to think about the high probability of negative outcomes in the future? Well, it's probably is because the brain is pathological in some way in depression. But the reason that patients can do that is because they have stored experiences of their past. And they can take these stored experiences of their past to create scenarios of the future that haven't happened yet. Even as we are speaking today, I think we have said things to each other which simulate possible futures that we might be doing in the future. And we just haven't thought about it because we do it so reflexively. That is, we have the contents of our sort of the basis of our consciousness or awareness. And then we have that tip of the iceberg the output of the awareness or the contents of consciousness, some of which we are aware of phenomenologically. We know that this is what we are thinking. But there's just a ton of stuff that we do that we just don't think about. We just do it. And because we do it, because we have no explicit awareness of it, we don't think it's particularly amazing that we do it, but we do it all the time.
Whoa. So there's all these predictions and simulations and things going on underneath the hood that are kind of moving us.
Think about it this way: you wouldn't get through life if we would not be able to get through life as the species that we are had we not been able to engage in this process of prospection. If you didn't have prospection, you would primarily be a reactive being. You would simply be reacting to your environment. The goal behind the advantage of prospection is it lessens your reliance on reaction, and it allows you to plan for outcomes that may be extremely harsh, that may be negative. They may not come to be, but the cost benefit ratio of prospection tends to be more favorable than unfavorable. So, for example, planning for a negative outcome isn't as problematic if the outcome doesn't come to be. You've already planned for it. And maybe the cost of planning for that negative outcome wasn't so high. But imagine the cost of not planning for it. So, for example, just a basic example, evacuating when there's a hurricane. The cost of evacuating when there isn't a hurricane isn't particularly high. It's a sustainable cost. But think of the cost of not evacuating when the hurricane comes. That cost is potentially catastrophic. Now, the fact that humans do this all the time, it's pretty amazing. And it depends on the human ability to take experiences of the past and to project into the future. And so, in other words, to not just experience it time from the past in the form of our episodic memories, but to form potential experiences of time into the future, which hasn't yet happened.
Okay. So how does this all tie back to cold exposure in humans?
So that there aren't straight lines that connect any of what we have been talking about with the cold exposure work. But the cold exposure work, actually, my colleague Autumn Music and I became very interested in this because there have been relatively few human studies of cold exposure for obvious reasons. It's difficult to come up with an experimental apparatus to study cold exposure. Whatever experimental apparatus that you would have to be done conjointly with the acquisition of data from the brain. And so a lot of the cold exposure work had been done in animals, primarily rat models. And, Otto and I were always of the opinion that that work doesn't generalize very well to humans because the ecology that the rat evolved to be part of is, as we just discussed a few minutes ago, is very different from the ecology that humans evolved to be part of. The way that humans engage in thermal regulation is we have a relatively limited ability to respond to catastrophic changes in our core body temperature. We engage in actions that preempt thermal regulatory challenge, that we try not to get into that situation. So the rat is obviously has not been bestowed with the kind of neural complexity that we have. And so they have a much more limited repertoire of behaviors. And so, the way in which that they regulate core body temperature is through some of these deep brain nuclei in regions like the hypothalamus and so on that are very responsive to exteroceptive signals. And then they sense neuronal signals that appear to allow the rodent to then change its core body temperature in response to environmental cold stress. Well, humans, like I said, our entire architecture is based on preempting that. And so we became immediately interested in trying to study cold exposure. And so we devised a series of experiments where, first of all, you needed the experimental apparatus. And so what we did was we created this, we didn't create it, but we purchased this experimental cold suit, which was not designed for the studies that we used it for, but I think is primarily used for bomb disposal. personnel. So, bomb disposal personnel, if they're in the desert, they're enclosed in a lot of shielding. It can get extremely hot inside that. So you have to keep them cool. Otherwise, they would be subjected to heat stress. And so they wear this suit, which is infused with small tubules. And you can actually infuse those tubules with cold water. And that can offset the heat stress that they might face when they're encased in this protective suit. And so we said to ourselves, why don't we take this cold suit and we clothe experimental volunteers in this cold suit? And then we can infuse the suit either with cold water or neutral temperature water. And so in doing that, you actually change their core body temperature. And while you're changing their core body temperature, we co-acquire a functional imaging data from the brain. And so we can try and understand what is the brain doing based on our limited ability to understand brain function from functional MRI. What is the brain doing while you're either cooling the participant or you're rewarming the participant? And so when you cool the participant, you evoke the sympathetic nervous system, which gets engaged. And then when you rewarm the participant, and as the core body temperature starts returning to baseline, now you evoke the parasympathetic. So this relaxation mode, if you will. So you have this flight mode, not exactly flight mode, but you have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And so we began to conduct these studies and we published several papers on this. And I think that these were amongst the very few papers that showed how parts of the human brain began to interact when you were cooling participants versus when you were rewarming participants. And several of these papers are actually quite interesting. And again, they're not a complete story, but they're beginning to tell the story that in the human brain, at least in the experimental setup that we use, how it generalizes to outside of our experimental setup, that's an open question. But at least in the experimental setup that we use, the sympathetic nervous system, when you actually stress the sympathetic nervous system, it evokes a certain set of network responses, which are quite different than when the brain is returning to baseline. And so that's how we became very interested in this whole concept of cold exposure. And so we started publishing these studies that demonstrated the kind of brain networks that become involved, how brain regions begin to interact with each other in different ways when you are cooling participants compared to rewarming. And so that's how we became very engaged in the study of cold stress. Obviously, not dangerous cold stress, because you have to be very, very careful because hypothermia is deadly. And so, we would only manipulate cold body temperature within a relatively narrow range. And so we would create what is called non-shivering thermogenesis. So you don't stress the body to the extent that you start to shiver. So it's non-shivering. And so it's uncomfortable, but it doesn't evoke sort of the shivering response that you have if you're standing outside on the sidewalk for an hour in the cold.
What happened in these participants' brains when they were experienced the cold stress versus when they were warming up?
So one of the interesting things that we found, and again, the disclaimer is that everything that I tell you is tentative. Like, this is not the conclusive story of what's happening in the brain, which is why I placed it within the context of the experiments that we did and the fact that they are not straightforwardly generalizable outside of our experimental setup. But one of the interesting things that we found in our analysis is, and this was a paper that we published in the journal Brain Structure and Function a couple of years ago, is when you look at the interactions between homeostatic networks, these are networks that are deep brain networks that are located primarily within the brainstem. The interoceptive networks, these are insular sensitive networks that are thought to be associated with encoding how we feel. So the insula is thought to be a region of the brain where different types of signals converge. And that's where presumably an emotional state gets attached to an interoceptive state. So that's why, again, I'm oversimplifying, but that's why feeling cold feels unpleasant, whereas feeling warm feels pleasant. So there's an unpleasant or a negative emotion associated with feeling cold, but there is a positive emotion associated with feeling warm. And so it's thought that the insular networks are associated with that. And then we have the control related networks or executive networks in the anterior cingulate, the prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex. And so from the brain signals that we collected, we tried to analyze how these different regions were interacting with each other. And one of the things that we seem to find is when you subjected individuals to cold stress, so in other words, when their core body temperature is dropping, we found that there were parallel functional pathways in the brain that were contextually evoked by the sympathetic nervous system. So not only was there a pathway from the brainstem, from the homeostatic networks to the interoceptive networks, but there was a parallel pathway from the homeostatic networks to directly to the executive networks. So in other words, and again, this is interpretation. The interpretation may be wrong, but one way to interpret it is when the brain begins to detect homeostatic stress, which may be potentially life-threatening. It was not obviously in our experiments, but which may be potentially life-threatening. The primitive areas of the brain send signals not only to the interoceptive regions of the brain, which translate those signals into an emotional response, but also have a parallel set of signals that bypass the interoceptive region and land directly on prefrontal regions for executive control. So, in a sense, preparing the brain for potential action. So, this loops back to what we were talking about predictive processing. That is, how does the brain prepare for action? So, it could be, and again, this is speculation, but it could be that when the sympathetic nervous system is evoked by cold stress, it creates these parallel functional pathways dynamically because it's detecting a challenge to the internal body state, which may have very negative consequences. And so it has to send signals not just to the interoceptive regions of the brain, but somehow it sends signals directly to executive regions of the brain to allow them potentially to plan for action.
Yeah, this starts to further explain what you said earlier of how one brain region doesn't act on its own. Even if we say that the homeostatic functions are largely in the brainstem, it's not like it's a one-player team and it's doing it. It's sending messages up to the, neocortex or whatever and saying, hey, do something, and then sending other messages out to this other player and the insulin saying, hey, I feel this and do something. I guess it sounds like maybe without these other players, it might not be able to actually do its supposed functions.
So, yeah, the presumption would be that if it was not able to dynamically form networks, and so this is another thing that we've written about, that is the brain, not just us, but lots of other people have written about this. The brain dynamically forms functional hierarchies. Why? Why does it dynamically form functional hierarchies? Well, the dynamics are necessary because the brain really doesn't know what it's going to be asked to do from minute to minute. I'm driving down the freeway. I drive down it every day. I'm never threatened. But I need to be, my brain needs to be in a state of preparation that some guy next to me swerves into my lane and I have to be able to take evasive action. Or if I'm driving down the freeway and 100 yards ahead of me, I see somebody driving somewhat erratically. Okay, I have to now decide, should I hang back or should I find a way to pass them? Because now in just doing that, again, we do this all the time. But think of what this involves. You have to now project into potential future scenarios. The fact that the person ahead of me is driving erratically. What does that mean? Could that be a danger to me? Could they be drunk? If I try to pass them, could they hit me? Now, these are things that have not happened yet, but I'm able to simulate the fact that they might happen. And so the point to be made is that if the brain, or if we were a primarily reactive system, we wouldn't get very far. because we would constantly be in a situation where we're simply reacting to what's happening around us. And so the great advantage of a system like the human brain in it being able to dynamically form functional hierarchies is that it can kind of divide up the labor in this way. And so the networks that I told you about a few minutes ago, the homeostatic network, the interoceptive network, the executive control network, you can think of these as being roughly hierarchically organized. So the homeostatic network, as I said, is in very deep brain nuclei in the brainstem. And we don't think of the brainstem as a cortical center. We don't say that we think with our brainstem, if you wanted to speak in those terms. We don't feel with our brainstem, but the brainstem still is very necessary in engaging in immediate thermal regulatory responses. But it also has to send signals up to interoceptive centers. So higher order regions in the brain can then begin to interpret what these signals mean and begin to attach affective labels to those signals. So that's why when we start to feel cold, we take evasive action. If we did not have the phenomenological experience of feeling cold, and if we didn't have a negative valence attached to it, why would we take evasive action? And if we didn't take evasive action at the onset of cold, well, I leave it to you to figure out what would happen to us. That's when you could freeze to death. And so the entire system depends on these functionally organized hierarchies to be able to be formed dynamically in response to context and to have these interactions in response to context and then somehow translate all these interactions into behaviors.
And then not only are these things kind of emerging or happening sort of bottom up, but I mean, it's kind of a back and forth type thing. But also, as humans, we have these sort of deliberate practices like breathing or meditation or other things that are often combined with the cold. Of course, Wim Hof does this as part of his Wim Hof method. Maybe you can explain some of these other kind of deliberate practices. Maybe we could take them one by one, but yeah, the two ones I'm thinking of right now are the breath work and then some kind of meditation or imagination exercise.
Yeah. Actually, it's, the whole idea behind breathwork is very interesting because, these are very ancient techniques. As you know, I mean, you live in Japan, so you know more than me the importance that meditative techniques have attached to breathwork. And more now, science is trying to understand the relationship between breathing and what it does to coupling across the brain. And the work is very complicated, and I don't profess to know all of it. But what seems to happen when we maintain a normal cadence of breathing is it seems to promote cross-frequency coupling across brain regions. And so in some sense, the normal cadence of breathing is sort of a homeostatic optimum that we engage in. Okay? It keeps everything sort of very stable. It allows us to focus. And the idea again is because you have this cross-frequency coupling across many regions, so this breathing is kind of yoked to that. And again, this is an oversimplified explanation, but this is one of the things that happens. The other thing that, as we've talked about for the last 15 minutes, is this importance that we stay at a thermal regulatory optimum. We want to be comfortable. And so we tend to stay within we try to keep our core body temperature within a thermal neutral zone. And so if it's warm, we dress so that we don't feel too hot. If it's cold, we dress so that we don't feel too cold. Like we discussed a few minutes ago, we tend to take evasive actions if we are threatened with the onset of cold or threatened with the onset of heat. And so you have these two systems that are, of course, linked to each other. The cadence of breathing that we maintain, that we strive to maintain, not necessarily consciously, but you have, again, deep brain nuclei like in the parabrachial nucleus and so on that are thought to regulate that. And then we want to stay within some thermal regulatory optimum. Now, the question is, what happens if we perturb these optimal states? So these states are perturbed under uncontrolled stress. So, for example, you're climbing a mountain and there are hundreds and hundreds of these unfortunate cases. You descend the mountain and it's too dark and you cannot get down from, the dead zone. You're stranded in the dead zone. You suffer from hypothermia. It's not typically the hypothermia that kills you, but along with hypothermia comes a loss of awareness. It comes a loss of the ability to reason properly because now presumably your brain starts slowly getting hypoxic. So that's an example of an uncontrolled exposure to cold stress. But what happens when you expose yourself in a controlled way to cold stress? Or if you expose yourself in a controlled way to a loss of cadence with breathing? Well, it turns out that we do these things all the time. Like when you go running, and again, it's not the only thing that happens. It's all yoked to your cardiovascular system. But when you go running, you're actually knocking your cadence of breathing outside its normal frequency and into another frequency. Now, because now you have, cardiovascular stress, it's controlled, but it's still stress. And we know now that what cardiovascular stress does, hard exercise does, is it causes the body to react. We know that cold exposure causes the body to react. And so Otto and I coined the term hormesis enhancement. So the term hormesis its roots are in Latin, and it refers to controlled stress. And so we know for a long time that hormetic stress actually has very salutary effects. And so that's why exercise has salutary effects. And that's why we're beginning to find out that cold exposure, the evidence is open, it's unclear, but it may have salutary effects. So these are two stressors that target the sympathetic nervous system, right? Any kind of stress is going to target a response from the sympathetic nervous system. Now, there is a parallel area of behavioral intervention techniques that have primarily been designed to target the parasympathetic nervous system. And this has to do with meditation, introspection, mindfulness. Okay. And so these techniques are typically never done when you are breathing chaotically. The entire basis of these methods are to engage in some form of interoceptive refocusing. You're typically refocusing on your internal body states. And correct me if I'm wrong, they are designed primarily around you maintaining a certain cadence of your breath. So many of these techniques, they use the cadence of your normal breathing as a scaffolding around which to focus internally. So you engage in interoceptive refocusing. So on the one hand, you have hormesis, whether it's breathing or it's cold exposure. And on the other hand, you have interoceptive refocusing, which is focusing on your internal body states. Now, nobody ever really thought of combining the two till maybe a few hundred years ago. And a few hundred years ago, people didn't think about hormetic stress or interoceptive refocusing in this way, but they began to realize that if you engaged in very frantic activity, which essentially knocked your system out of homeostasis. And so a lot of this was calisthenic activity. It was cardiovascular activity. And at the end of it, you kind of lie down. And as your body is returning to baseline, you now are slowly asked to focus on your internal body state as it returns to baseline. So you have this hormesis, and then you have interoceptive refocusing that follows the hormesis. So you knock your body out of its homeostatic optimum, and as it is returning to its homeostatic optimum, you engage in interoceptive refocusing. And it turns out, or it seems to be, that this kind of hormesis-enhanced interoceptive refocusing may actually have substantial salutary effects. Again, the evidence is very tentative and is by no means conclusive. But it appears to be the case that when you have novices trained in this kind of technique, and so there are a couple of papers where people were trained in the method that Wim uses. We trained novices in, again, the method that Wim uses. Again, that's not the only way to engage in hormesis-enhanced interoceptive refocusing, but there is evidence of effects on the immune system. Again, it's tentative, it has to be replicated, but there is some evidence that there is an increase in anti-inflammatory cytokines, which means that the immune system seems to be more resistant to inflammation after that. We have published evidence that suggests that there are differences in how the brain responds to cold stress before and after training in these methods. And we have published evidence that suggests that the density of cannabinoid receptors, so endocannabinoids and endogenous cannabinoids in the brain, are thought to be associated with the regulation of mood and anxiety. And so we have evidence that when you train novices in these methods, their cannabinoid receptor density in key areas of the brain increases. Again, these studies are incomplete and not conclusive in any way. But the suggestion is that you can use hormesis enhancement and couple it with interoceptive refocusing to amplify the salutary effects that might accrue simply from hormesis or simply from interoceptive refocusing. And so the idea is that maybe combining these two methods amplifies the effects that you would see simply through cold exposure or through breathwork or simply through meditation or mindfulness.
It makes sense though, because I imagine if you push your nervous system to one extreme, it's the homeostatic functions are going to kind of start bringing it back to homeostasis, which is the other direction. But then when you're proactively kind of inciting this other pole of the spectrum, it might push it over to that side faster, I guess, or like it might be like, oh, because so you're going from stress. Anytime you experience a lot of stress, your body's probably going to naturally try to bring it back to the middle or, closer to that end. But then you're at the same time, while it's kind of moving over here, you're kind of like, boom, let's throw in the other extreme. And that must create a powerful, almost drug-like effect.
So we actually think that, drug-like may not be the right way to put it, but we think that there is a reason why people feel euphoric after doing it. And I mean, you can just go online and you can look at videos of people who engaged in dynamic meditation. There are people who called it dynamic meditation, where you basically are just kind of hyperventilating for tens of minutes at a time and jumping up and down. So essentially really stressing your cardiovascular system. And at the end of it, these people would just lie down in this yogic pose of Shavasana and then just kind of reflect on their internal body state as everything kind of gets back to baseline. And, we don't know exactly what causes this experience of euphoria. And again, it's maybe multi-causal, and we may never know conclusively, but it may well be that the expectation, the brain, this again gets back to, we were talking about prospection and expectation. And the expectation of a return to baseline and refocusing on the internal body state as it is returning to baseline may create this expectation driven amplification of this sense of euphoria, if you know what I'm trying to say. And so you know that your system is returning to baseline. You were stressed. You controlled how you stressed your system. Now, as the system is being knocked out of homeostasis, is now slowly returning to homeostasis, and you are bringing your internal attention towards that return to homeostasis, and boom, it eventually arrives there. And so, again, I'm oversimplifying, but this is kind of what people talk about in placebo. In placebo, the idea is that I'm taking a drug that's going to make me feel better. I don't know that the drug that I'm being given is not a real drug. I don't know that it's a placebo, but I expect to feel better. And therefore, at the end of taking it, I end up sort of feeling better anyway. And so it could well be that what's happening under hormesis-enhanced interoceptive focusing is this form of top-down driven placebo effect that people just feel better because they expect that they're going to end up back at baseline. And that kind of amplifies the release of endorphins or endogenous cannabinoids and so on. Again, it's a theory and it's very speculative, but there is now experimental data in volunteers that suggests that something is happening, something is changing. And it's just not just that people say that they feel better, but we have some biological correlates of that, whether it's with the study that looked at anti-inflammatory cytokines, whether it's our study that looked at neuroimaging with functional MRI and with positron emission tomography. There is something that's happening. There's no doubt about that.
So what is what is the sort of neurochemical story happening with this euphoria or feeling better? We've heard that part of that story is an increase of norepinephrine, and then that I guess leads to dopamine rise. I guess Andrew Huberman's sort of been talking about this for a while. But then you've mentioned things like endocannabinoids, and there are other things. Yeah, maybe you can kind of bring us through as much as you can understand.
It's all almost some version of everything that you have said is going to be correct, but it's all speculative. We have no way of knowing clearly. Our PET data is very interesting because it clearly shows that there is an increase in cannabinoid receptor function, which suggests that there is, again, we don't know if that means that there is an increased release of endocannabinoids. We were not able to measure that directly. But the very fact that you have a change in cannabinoid receptor density suggests that that may have a functional correlate. And it could well be that it changes the release of endocannabinoids in the brain, and that actually creates a sense of well-being, if you will. Again, it's purely speculative. We have no conclusive evidence to support that idea. We have experimental data, but that's where the limitation of neuroscience comes in. Once you have experimental data, you have to interpret it. It's not like solving a mathematical theorem. Data have to be interpreted, and any set of data can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. There is not one single interpretation.
It's hard to hear the word cannabinoid and not think of marijuana. So how does this explain anything? And this is not your territory, perhaps, but there are effects and reasons we people take THC or CBD, I guess. But probably THC is probably more actively affecting the CB1 and CB2 receptors. But and again, this might be out of your realm. But yeah, can this teach us anything about marijuana?
It's out of my realm, but I think it could well be. So the idea is a lot of people who take marijuana, again, I don't know if it's true or not, but the hypothesis is that they're self-medicating, that addiction is a form of self-medication, that it makes them feel better. And it presumably makes them feel better because it binds to the CB1 and CB2 receptors in the brain, and there are anxiolytic effects that are associated with that. Now, what we're studying is potentially, we don't know conclusively, but potentially the release of endogenous cannabinoids without smoking marijuana, without smoking cannabis. And it potentially could be a pathway, again, purely speculative, but this kind of an intervention could be a kind of pathway for managing a wide range of sub-threshold conditions that people deal with, like anxiety, sort of borderline depression, things of that nature. Again, we cannot say conclusively, but the broad theoretical framework certainly motivates that possibility that, conducting this kind of breath work, or what we call hormesis-enhanced interoceptive refocusing, it may be a very cost-effective, it may be a very accessible way, a very accessible lifestyle intervention that allows people who might otherwise feel a little bit out of whack emotionally in terms of anxiety and so on, it might allow them to get themselves back into sort of a homeostatic optimum in emotional terms. But again, we're trying to do large scale studies on this. It's not easy to do large scale studies because this kind of work is very expensive in terms of resources, but also very expensive in terms of participant time to do the study design right. But I have no problems in personally believing that some version of what I'm saying is true. That's different from saying that it's scientifically demonstrated.
And there are other activities and experiences that push our body into this sympathetic land and then either perhaps simultaneously, but probably sequentially afterwards, puts us in this sort of calm parasympathetic state. You can probably think of a lot more examples than me, but some that may correctly or incorrectly come to mind are certain sports, especially some kind of team sport where you're working together and you're feeling good. It's like a nice, playful, any kind of play, really. Maybe playing music together or even being at a concert, having consensual sex, various activities, a lot of things that we love doing, actually, that we would call like happy things that make us happy seem to maybe be similar.
But and are potentially and are strenuous.
It's like you're combining stress with, this active
That's right.
interoceptive refocusing of calming down,
Yeah.
putting us in this parasympathetic state. And it's like, wow, so cold exposure is not the only thing, but it's like it's an example that sort of highlights this larger realm of human experiences that are maybe doing something similar.
Correct. And I don't mean to say that what we have thought about is something revolutionary. In fact, we are simply characterizing in a semi-methodical framework what humans have intuited for the longest time. So it's not like we're discovering something here. We're just kind of placing a framework on what humans seem to have known for centuries. That, they're doing these methods or these techniques in all kinds of spontaneous and maybe not particularly well codified ways, but humans seem to have intuited that these kinds of things help them. That's why people run, for example. They realize that running can make them feel euphoric. That's why people take cold plunges. You have all of these polar bear clubs. People feel euphoric after doing that. And of course, there are lots of things associated with it. Again, there is no monocausal explanation. And so, for example, taking a cold plunge, a lot of the euphoria comes from the buildup of expectation of doing something very aversive and then doing it, like bungee jumping, for example. A lot of the stress comes with the anticipation of doing it. And then once you do that, you know that stress levels come down, you know that cortisol comes down. A lot of cortisol is built up in the anticipation of a stressful event. So it's not that hormesis enhancement and interoceptive refocusing are the entire story. There are lots of other subtexts that are involved. But I feel comfortable in believing that hormesis enhancement of interoceptive refocusing will ultimately be proven to have the cost benefit ratio of this to very large numbers of people is going to be very high. It's going to be very accessible. And it's much easier to do than just meditation in and of itself. Meditation actually is quite difficult to do. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but it's not easy to stabilize your mind. And so meditation has a place, but in terms of amplifying our sense of well being, it may well be that something like a hormesis enhancement has a much more important place than meditation alone.
Yeah, it gets me thinking. I guess we're all sort of self-medicating in some way, not necessarily through a drug, but then it gets to this other point of like, what even is a drug at this point? Because if our body's responding to our own state and the environment through, I don't know, running or going in a cold plunge or, maybe it's smoking some drug or drinking alcohol or something, it's like, what exactly even is a drug now? It kind of even blurs those lines.
I think I mean, again, this is a simplification, but you can think of drugs as shortcuts to achieve a goal that might otherwise take a longer time to achieve. And I think that's kind of how I think, not of all drugs, because some drugs obviously you need to take, otherwise you just cannot do without. But a lot of drugs sort of these kinds of drugs that are thought to enhance neuronal function and so on. I don't know what the science behind them is, but I think you can think of them as just kind of a shortcut to achieve something that might have taken a little bit longer to achieve had you not taken the drug.
Well, then on that note, you've also done a lot of work on mood disorders, things like bipolar and depression, along with schizophrenia. Of course, these are very serious conditions, and often the times they are treated with drugs, with pharmaceuticals. This is all speculative at this point, but it does make us all think, oh well, maybe we can try these other quote unquote drugs, cold exposure, etc., to maybe help people with not just, as you mentioned earlier, people with anxiety or some of these sort of subthreshold conditions, but also some of these deeper, more problematic things like even bipolar or I don't know, schizophrenia. But it's all speculative, I know.
Yeah, I think that would be unlikely. I think, see, there's a tendency to oversell or overextend these kinds of interventions. And I think that they have a place, but they don't play the role that medicine plays.
Yeah.
So I think medicine has a role and interventions have a role. And so, for example, I exercise, I go to the gym, but I also take a statin because I I believe and I'm convinced that I need to take the statin to manage my lipid profile better. But I just don't take the statin. I also exercise. And so in the same way, even in the case of neuropsychiatric illness, it's been now well accepted that a combination of therapies, um, neuroleptics, in combination with psychotherapy, for example, is thought to be more effective. So these kinds of methods, they are not there to supplant the kinds of interventions that are needed to stabilize serious conditions. However, it could well be that a lot of people who are on anxiolytics may not need anxiolytics. And in fact, they might be better served by engaging in this self-driven intervention that allows them to stabilize their mood much better and without having the burden of medication. So again, these are speculations, but I think that there are certain conditions which may not be medical, but which are treated as medical, but served, maybe better served by an intervention. But there are certain conditions that are very clearly medical, and the typical medical interventions that are used cannot be supplanted by the kinds of interventions that we're talking about. So we have to be very clear that we are not talking about medicine when we talk about hormesis enhancement, interoceptive refocus. We're talking about a lifestyle intervention that can have the promise of helping lots of people, doesn't seem to have any negative side effects that we can tell. Certain people should not be doing cold exposure. People with cardiac conditions should not be stressing themselves to a certain extent and so on. But a lot of other people, they can probably do it. They might well feel happier than if they didn't do it. And there don't seem to be any side effects. Why should there be any side effects? It's after all something that you're doing on your own.
Yeah. Yeah, but you're right. I'm glad you kind of reminded me, you kind of reeled me back in. It's easy to get too excited about any of these things and be like, yeah, this is gonna save us all. But it, like with anything, like just because we have cold exposure, these techniques, etc., it doesn't mean we're gonna start, removing our jacket and turning off our heater. We're still going to use our jacket and our gloves and our heater and the other technologies that help us with the cold. We don't need to be relying on just one. And because now you got your carrots or you did some eye exercises, you can break your and throw away your glasses. And the glasses are kind of useful. So yeah, thanks for kind of reeling me back in. It's easy to get carried away and get excited about all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. The problem that I see in the field is that, I mean, there are different types of people, but there's a large subgroup of people who feel that the world is over medicated. There is a hunger for alternative therapies. There is a feeling that the world is ruled by pharma, it's ruled by insurance companies. And so there's this kind of grievance that's built up against that. And so then these people somewhat credulously gravitate towards all these kinds of interventions that they're being sold as being transformative. And that, I think, does them a disservice because, again, there is a place for all of these things. And what works, what place these things hold for you depends on what you need these things to be there for. So, again, if you have schizophrenia, hormesis-enhanced interoceptive refocusing is not going to solve the problem that you have schizophrenia. You have to be stabilized with schizophrenia. When you're stabilized with schizophrenia, it could well be that hormesis enhancement of interoceptive refocusing, it might help you a little bit, but it's not going to cure schizophrenia. And so the problem is that I think a lot of people are sort of reflexively receptive to these alternative types of ideas. And a lot of these alternative ideas have simply not been demonstrated to be conclusively true. And I'm telling you that we have done the experiments that we have done. We have done the studies that we have done. And I'm sitting here telling you that I cannot say conclusively that our evidence is true. And I've said this repeatedly through the course of the interview, that we have the data. We have to interpret the data. There are many interpretations of the data. I'm giving you one interpretation, but there could be others.
Yeah, and that's another part of the dynamic system is we humans are kind of recreating the world by building things and making technologies, and somehow it's easy to feel like because we made it, it's somehow not real or something. It's almost just how we make our dreams and we make these exercises, these imaginary exercises that are like, it's not quite real. In the same sense, I think a lot of people feel like there's something wrong with technology, including pharmaceuticals, because it's like this man-made thing. But I guess it's part of the dynamic system was we're recreating the world, but then it doesn't make these things less real or valuable. But it's hard to take our own creations as seriously as the ones that nature kind of built for us.
See, I mean, there's kind of an interesting paradox. So a lot of people who are very again, I'm overgeneralizing, but a lot of people who are very conspiratorial about pharma and so on, they rely on technology to transmit these conspiracy theories. I mean, they are the ones who are overly reliant on uncurated social media to just kind of transmit these ideas that are not based in anything. And yet they think of themselves as being anti-technology because they think that technology or certain kinds of technology are bad. But I mean, I think that these are just oversimplifications on their part, that it may well be that a certain aspect of pharma is a business. And so, part of business is to make money and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that medical intervention isn't necessary in some cases. Many, many different things can be true at the same time. It could be true that many people are being over medicated or they over medicate themselves. But it is also true that medication is needed for certain kinds of individuals. So those are not contradictory terms. So I find it kind of interesting that people hold the capacity for double think, as Orwell said, or multi think is amazing in people.
Yeah, creating this like very strong barrier between you and these medications, but then completely opening the gates to this like much larger wave of information coming in through social
Correct.
media, which is
Correct.
going to have many more toxins and problems, but somehow
Absolutely.
that's okay. But because it's coming in through our eyes and our ears, it's somehow not going to affect us the same way as it going through our veins or I guess, through a pill or whatever. Like, wow.
We just published a paper exactly on this question about the challenge that human regulatory systems are facing in the age of abundance. And it's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. And Auto Music and I were very interested in this question of what has happened to human regulatory systems as the world has quickly shifted from an environmental regime of scarcity. And so, till about 200 years ago, think about food. Till about 200 years ago, people did not have food security. And so you can presume, again, we don't know conclusively, but you can presume that people ate because their internal model of the world was telling them that you should eat now because you don't know when you'll be eating again. because we're living under food scarcity. Think of where we are now. In vast portions of the world, you have the opposite. You have an abundance of food. And so why now do you see conditions like obesity and diabetes just exploding? It's not just because the population is exploding, but it's because the environment has changed. But it's very plausible that our regulatory systems haven't changed. They haven't adapted to abundance. And so people now are just eating gluttonously, not necessarily because they're gluttons, but because they are saddled with the regulatory system that is teaching them or is driving them to eat because it is still assuming that there may not be food going forward. Now, the same thing is happening with information. Till about 20 years ago, how did you get information? One channel on the radio, one newspaper that you opened up. And so you had a flow of information that was finite and that was restricted, and your emotional systems could handle it. Where are we now? Now information is kind of like flak that they used to use in the war, where you're just kind of firing shells in the air aimlessly, and you have no idea what's going to hit. And that's where we are with information. And so why do you think that there is this increase in anxiety, in mood disorders, in grievances in the population? Because their regulatory systems for information are simply not able to deal with, as you were saying, information that is entering us through all of these sensory channels. Our brains just cannot deal with it. And so you have this strange paradox where you have the collective of the species that has created food security, and it has created technologies for disseminating information. But the individual of the species is still saddled with biological systems that are still ancient, that are still stuck in the rut, that they're expecting scarcity. But instead, the system is awash in abundance. And so these systems cannot adapt. And so that's why you have, not that's why, but it's a plausible reason for why you have all of these obesity-related conditions, endocrine-related conditions, on one side with food abundance, and on the other side with information abundance. You have emotional conditions like anger, grievance, depression, anxiety. And so I think that there is a very good case to be made that these are modern problems, and unless we find a way of facing them, these problems are only going to multiply.
Yeah, well, after that paper comes out, I'm looking forward to reading it and maybe having you back on for a short discussion about
Sure.
that. And maybe I'll
I
try
would
to
love that.
keep it under 2 hours next time. But I want to dig into it more now. But
That's right. We've been at it for 2 hours. You're right.
yeah, no, but I was kind of hoping and hoping for this, and I'm glad we could do it. We did a little warm up chat last time, and it just reminded me of like what I miss about being a student. If me and my friends just going to the bar, not to pick up girls, but just to talk, talk about what we're studying and stuff, and we just talk all night. And you do this with your brother sometimes. I do this with my brother. He's homeless now, but we used to stay up all night and just talk and talk and talk and philosophize basically. So I'm really happy to find someone to play with.
One of the nice things I would say, so the thing with, we were talking about this difference between scarcity and abundance, right? So if you as an individual can manage the abundance in constructive ways, then you can make it work for you. So if you could curate your way through information and not just get distracted by the kinds of things that random people say on different channels, the world now can really be your library. You need to have the instincts to know what you need to read. So you have to be able to curate the information that you get. But you can just be a student all the time. Whereas 30 years ago, if you wanted to learn something, the avenues through which you could learn were much more limited. And so at the same time that you have the vulnerabilities that abundance gives, at the individual level, we can turn those vulnerabilities into opportunities for ourselves. And so you were talking about, this reminds you of being a student, but actually in some ways you can be a student all the time now. And that's the beauty of what we can do now. Like you and I wouldn't have been talking but for these channels for disseminating information. And when I speak, I try and be very careful about what I speak about, and I try and be very conservative in drawing conclusions from the science that we do. And my hope is that in learning about what we do and learning to be careful in interpreting data, the lay listener might be better positioned to interpret the kind of flood of scientific information that they're given all the time, or the false scientific information that they're given all the time. So, you try and create an opportunity out of what might be a vulnerability.
Speaking of friends or people to play with and converse with, you've done a lot of your work with auto music. Maybe you can talk about that sort of system between you and him together. You and him working together. It's almost like like in the brain, we have different parts of the brain kind of working together as a team. It seems like you and him seem to be a powerful team. And what kind of brings that power, do you think?
And, you mentioned the brain. It's interesting. So, just as you remember, we talked about brain regions having relative specializations to do different things. So, the same way, when you have meaningful collaborators, it becomes meaningful if each of you have sort of different kinds of quote unquote specializations to do different things. And so we have a little bit of that complementarity with each other. So he's trained as a pet physicist. My PhD was in an area of cognitive neuroscience, and I don't do pet work, I do MRI work. And I'm not an MR physicist, but I'm a informed user of MRI. And so we have those complementary methods that we use. But then generally around that, we also were interested in similar kinds of things. Like he was interested in central nervous system mechanisms behind thermal regulatory defense in humans, because in some of the work that he was doing, looking at the activation of supraclavicular brown fat, and these findings were done in rodents, and some of the pet work that he was doing, he found that they did not translate particularly well to humans. And that so the model of why the activation of brown fat might help with thermal regulatory defense, which came from rodents, appeared to not translate very well to humans. And so we both got very interested in trying to come up with ways to study the central nervous system in the human brain in ways that people had not studied before. And so that's how we both became very interested in studying the in vivo brain mechanisms of thermal regulatory defense. But then, with we talk about static versus dynamics. When you are thinking about scientific questions, it does not pay to be static. You have to think in dynamic terms. You have to think about what does this imply, or what can we infer from this? And then from the next thing, what can we infer from the next thing? And so we've gone from experiment to theory to theoretical papers in one area, to experiment in other areas, to theoretical papers in other areas. And so it's sort of this lattice of ideas that you build, providing you have the right set of collaborators who just have enough of an overlap that you can work together, but much more of sort of a complementary way of thinking of things. So you can place ideas within a somewhat of a competitive framework to make them better.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy that my system bumped into your system, and I'm excited to see what sort of butterfly effects, start emerging after this. So, yeah, thank you, Vaibhav.
As am I. This is very stimulating. I enjoyed it. My absolute pleasure, and I hope we meet again. And as I've said, anytime you need to reach out, feel free to email me or give me a call if you have any questions.
Thank you. I finally have a friend. Yay. Thank you.
Probably have more friends than you realize.
That's right. That's right. I think we all do. Anyway, thank you, Vaibhav. I'm glad to have a new friend.
My pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day in Japan.